Hello, good morning. My name is Bea Copin. I'm a reporter at Rappler, and I'm in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. It's the third day of us covering the ASEAN Summit, the 40th ASEAN Summit, 40th and 41st ASEAN Summit, and other related summits. It's technically our fourth day in Cambodia, although we did arrive late November 9 in the evening. Bakit background agad? Anyway, I'm here covering as like I said, the ASEAN summits here in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. It's the first in-person na high-level leaders or meeting of the heads of state and heads of government. It is also the first time that Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is joining a regional meet, his first time as head of state. So a lot of firsts happening here in Phnom Penh. But before we talk about our coverage here and what we've been doing in Cambodia, I wanna show you a little of Phnom Penh. In case you're wondering, I am in the hotel where we're staying at, and I'll explain a little later on why I'm here. So let's wait for the light to adjust eventually. Usually it does. There you go. Beautiful, beautiful Phnom Penh. Ayun, yung area namin, napakalapit lang namin sa venue actually ng ASEAN, sa main venue ng summit. Sorry, sobrang liwanag ng araw. It's around 9:30 in Phnom Penh, 10:30 in the Philippines. So if you can see behind me, although baka hindi malinaw, dalawang river nakapalibot. Because I'm not very good at geography, I don't know which one. I cannot tell at the top of my mind which one is the Mekong and which one is the other river whose name I cannot pronounce properly yet. Apologies to our Cambodian friends who might just be watching, but let me adjust my tripod, my camera a little. So, yes, I'm in the hotel. In case you're wondering, actually, kasi meron namang media center, syempre yung ASEAN. It's the same hotel where the leaders are meeting for the summits. But sometimes the internet there is a little difficult or challenging since maraming media covering there from all over the region, all over the world, really. So, thankfully, though, we are able to monitor the summits. Kaya 40th and 41st summits and other related summits. Kasi yung dalawang ASEAN summit, the 40th and the 41st, tapos na siya kahapon. Or nangyari siya, sorry, I'm confused with the date already. The first two summits happened on November 11, when the summits actually formally opened. Although November 10, andito na lahat ng ASEAN, or most of the ASEAN leaders. One head of state / head of government is not here. The Malaysian Prime Minister is busy campaigning back in Malaysia. So in his stead, they sent the House Speaker of Malaysia to represent the country at the ASEAN. So on the 10th, may mga interfaces yung tawag nila. With the parliament, with members of parliament from all over ASEAN, with ASEAN Youth also, and the Business Advisory Council of ASEAN. But this actual summit began formally on the 11th. So back-to-back yun, yung 40th and 41st summit. And then you had other summits, including the summits that I'll be talking about later on. So what do I say when I say summits? So ASEAN and a partner, a dialogue partner, or a major ally of ASEAN yung magsa-summit, magda-dialogue. For example, yesterday, you had China, you had ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN plus 3 is the ASEAN nations plus China, South Korea, and Japan. Meron ding ASEAN-India Summit, meron ding commemorative na ASEAN-Canada Summit, nagkaroon ng ASEAN-Japan Summit, ASEAN-Australia Summit. Yesterday also was the ASEAN-US Summit. There was also a summit on the first day, I believe, between ASEAN and the United Nations. So ito yung chance for the leaders of the bloc, as in they stand there, of course, representing the interests of their country, but also it's the bloc, as in the region, speaking to their counterpart during these summits. Of course, meron ding side meetings, which we call, if it's between two heads of state, or actually two counterparts, yung bilateral meetings sinasabi nila. So far, President Marcos here in Phnom Penh has had at least 3 or 2 bilateral meetings. He spoke with 2 bilateral meetings, I believe so. He spoke with Brunei and South Korea yesterday. He is set to have at least 2 more bilateral meetings today. We'll talk about that later. So yun. Again, it's technically been the 3rd day of us covering the ASEAN and President Marcos's participation in the ASEAN. Although parang 4 days running na yung coverage that we have here in Cambodia. So if you have any questions, I think I'll be able to read them. Okay, if you have questions, I think I'll be able to access them via the comment section of the stream. So if you want to ask anything about covering the ASEAN and how ASEAN works, so siguro I'll talk a little bit about how we cover the ASEAN. Like I mentioned, I'm in the hotel. In our hotel, not the hotel, the Sok Hayong Hotel, where the summit is being held. I'm in the hotel where we're sleeping in. So there is a media center, but unfortunately, sometimes the internet becomes shaky kasi nga ang daming media na lumilipadan. But thankfully, we are able to monitor the summits remotely. But to a certain extent lang. Kasi when these summits happen, normally yung sinistream or yung allowed lang yung media to cover are the opening statements. So the opening statement by the ASEAN chairman, in this case, the ASEAN chairman is of course the head of government of Cambodia, so si Prime Minister Hun Sen, his opening statement, and the opening statement of the counterpart ng ASEAN in that summit. So, for example, Chinese Prime Minister Lee will speak, and that's televised or that's streamed. In the US summit, obviously, US President Joe Biden speaks, that's streamed. The media is the pool media who are allowed access kasi limited access lang. Ang liit kasi ng venue. Or hindi maliit, pero limited yung access syempre kasi you have heads of state, heads of government there and their staff and their support staff, ASEAN Secretariat. So limited lang yung space for the media. But after those opening statements, typically the chairman, Prime Minister Hun Sen, gently asks the media to please exit the venue. And from then, hindi mo na marinig kung ano yung mga sinasabi ng mga world leaders. Yung tawag sa mga sinasabi nila interventions, kumbaga dun nila nilalahad, or that's where they talk about their stand on specific issues. Sometimes they also specify the agenda of your country, the country that they represent. Obviously, you don't speak on behalf of other countries. You only speak on behalf of your own country. So, how do we have access to these interventions? Usually, release na lang ng government or ng the government of that head of state or head of government will release that to media later on. Like in the case of the Philippines, like for President Marcos, we only find out about his interventions or what he said during his interventions when the Office of the Press Secretary sends out press releases, and then they'll eventually send a transcript of the entire intervention. And since day 2, kasi medyo mahirap nga yung setup because nga by default, hindi nire-record at hindi ini-air yung interventions ng heads of state and heads of government. So on day 2, the Office of the Press Secretary facilitated recording the interventions of the president, of the Philippine president. Hindi naman sila nag-release ng interventions ng ibang bansa. Yun naman, depende na rin yun sa diskarte or sa proseso ng isang specific government. So just so we have an idea of how access here goes. Kasi syempre, it's a high-level meeting of heads of state, heads of government. If you check TikTok, or maybe it's just TikTok in our part of the world, because obviously Cambodia is the host, you will see short footages or like TikToks of like the security that the United States has brought into Cambodia, of course, to protect their President Joe Biden. He's here. He's been here since yesterday, actually. So, and if you notice kanina, I don't know, feeling ko hindi nyo nakita kasi parang maliwanag masyado yung likod ko, no? Sobrang luwang at peaceful ng streets ng Phnom Penh ngayon. And if you lived in Metro Manila or you were in Metro Manila when we hosted summits like APEC or ASEAN. You'll understand why. Kasi a lot of portions of the street, many streets are closed partially or in full in varying degrees because of the summit. Syempre, kasi like for example, the roads immediately surrounding Soka Hotel, very restricted yung access. Like for example, kami nakakapasok kami kasi may accreditation yung vehicle that we have, and we have accreditation ourselves. But for the rest, other parts of the city, parang some parts are also closed totally for a short while as a specific head of state, for example, passes by. In the case of, for example, US President Joe Biden, security is really extra strict. Like roads talaga are shut down or super restricted access while his convoy passes by. So things like that, no? Parang, again, if you were in Metro Manila or you read about what was happening in Metro Manila when we were hosts of APEC or ASEAN, this would be very, very familiar to you as well. Because, of course, again, you have the 10 heads of delegation. Most of them are heads of state or heads of government in the ASEAN, and you have the ASEAN partners. So you have the US president here, the Canadian prime minister is here, other like the president of the EU is here. So you have all these high profile world leader na nga, high profile pa, in Phnom Penh for the ASEAN summit. Also for short context lang, ang daming summits na nangyayari in the region actually ngayon. So you have ASEAN happening in Phnom Penh, and then by next week, almost exact to the date, literally 1 week after ASEAN opens, you have the APEC summit in Bangkok, Thailand naman. And between that or sabay nun ay G20, which the Philippines is not part of, but the G20 is happening in Bali. G20 naman, leaders such as the leaders of Canada, the US participate in the G20. So that's another high-profile summit happening in the ASEAN or the Southeast Asian region. So just a quick summary of what happened here yesterday, at least from the Philippine perspective, or from the media covering President Marcos. Kahapon, he was invited by the World Economic Forum founder and executive chairman Klaus Schwab. They had a breakfast meeting actually before the official events of the ASEAN started, and this was a very early breakfast meeting because the events in the ASEAN start rather early. President Marcos was formally invited to join the WEF from January 16 to 20 in Davos, Switzerland. And then the first summit was the ASEAN +3 summit. Again, ASEAN +3 is the ASEAN bloc plus Korea, South Korea, Japan, and China. And then President Marcos had informal conversations with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. When we say informal, as in talagang nakita lang sila on the sidelines of the summits and they spoke briefly, this is as opposed to a bilateral meeting na talagang nakalatag yan. You have a team from Philippines and a team from the other country, and then counterparts speaking to each other, of course, led by the head of state or the head of government, and the head of state or head of government of the other country. And then usually they're surrounded by typically top-ranking government officials and for the foreign affairs or the foreign minister or the foreign affairs secretary, depending on who's available or what the topics of discussion will be. Meron ding, magkakape muna tayo kasi maaga pa dito 9:44 pa lang dito. And then ASEAN is closing in a few hours. So you're joining me for my second morning coffee today. And then there was also the ASEAN-Indian Summit, ASEAN-Australia Summit, ASEAN-Japan Summit. Again, 2 bilateral meetings. First with Sultan Hassan Al Bolkiah of Brunei, and then a bilateral meeting with the South Korean president, then the ASEAN-US Summit, followed by the ASEAN-Canada Commemorative Summit, and then they had a gala dinner last night. Today naman, let me double check our schedule for today. So today is the last day of the ASEAN Summit. Yung closing ceremony is around noon Cambodia time, so that would be around 1 p.m. Um, in the Philippines. So hold on, I'm drowning with all the messages that I'm kidding. Okay, so earlier today was the second ASEAN Global Dialogue, followed by the East Asia Summit. So yun naman, Asian countries, including countries obviously outside of Southeast Asia. And then finally, the closing ceremony. Actually, the East Asia Summit is about to happen pa pala. It's 10:15 a.m. Cambodia time, so that's around 30 minutes from now. And then finally, the closing ceremony of the ASEAN summits at around 12:30 p.m. Cambodian time, 1:30 p.m. in the Philippines. And then the president does have two bilateral meetings. He already confirmed one of these meetings in the past with Canada, with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He arrived here yesterday. Then he has another bilateral meeting with a representative from Europe. So baka mag-wonder din pala kayo kung bakit parang minsan may mga bilateral meeting na nauudlot or nagagalaw. Yung bilateral meeting kasi, so kunwari, one country talks to another and says, hey, we want to have a bilateral, or our head of state or head of government wants to speak to their counterpart from your part of the world, let's have a bilateral meeting. And then the other country will respond, yeah, parang, okay, do they want to speak to the head of government, head of state of that inviting country, or would they rather not? So when they confirm na yes, that's the easy part. The difficult part is figuring out kung anong oras during, usually these things happen on the sidelines of summits or gatherings of heads of state. For example, in the ONGA in New York, di ba, President Marcos met with US President Joe Biden and also Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Yung mahirap na part in figuring out kung saan sa schedule ng dalawang world leaders sisingitin or mangyayari itong side meetings. So before flying out to Phnom Penh, the DFA did confirm that they'd be meeting with Cambodia, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, and the chairman of the ASEAN. Also, South Korea. Yung Brunei, parang later on na rin na-confirm na the president would be meeting with the Sultan of Brunei. During the flight to Phnom Penh on PR001, he told the media that he would be meeting with Canada or na-confirm na yung schedule with Canada. I believe they were working on a schedule with the French President Macron. But we'll see if that pushes through. Either way, there are also other summits where they may be able to catch each other. And then finally, Marcos in Cambodia wraps up with a meeting with the Filipino community. That's always a tradition of the Philippine president wherever he goes, not just Marcos. Talagang every president, at least in the time that I've been covering Philippine news, they do have a meeting always with the Filipino community in whichever country they're visiting. Yung pinagkaiba lang dito ngayon, typically first event ito ni President Marcos, at least how he's been doing things. So when he had a state visit to Indonesia and to Singapore, his first event was a meeting with the Filipino community. During a working visit to the US for the ONGA, his first event was with the Filipino community. But because of the very tight schedules here in ASEAN, this will be his final event in Cambodia before he flies out and back to Manila. In case you're wondering, for the first time kasi, binuksan ng PR001. First time under President Marcos, binuksan ng PR001 to media covering him. So, kaya, hindi naman ngarag, pero today will be quite exciting and jam-packed because we need to make it in time, obviously, for PR. I mean, we will be covering, obviously, the president closely, so hindi naman kami malalayo. Pero, yun. Kung tataka din kayo, bakit yung footage ng ambush interview or chance interview with the president en route to Phnom Penh was yung aeroplano yung background dahil he's aboard PR001. I hear the footsteps of my roommate arriving. Hold on. I'll just say hi to her quickly. But yeah, that's a summary more or less of the events here. You can go inside, it's okay. Yeah, so we have roommates here when we fly abroad and cover the president. Siyempre, para makatipid din at para hindi din kami matakot mag-isa after a long day of covering the president. What else? What else? Okay, for summaries of his interventions, again, ano yung intervention? Basically, that's when the head of state or the head of government puts forward his or her or their position, the country's position, during a specific summit in this case. So, my summary of his interventions, unfortunately, not all of the interventions have full transcripts, but kung may full transcript available, we do upload that para mabasa nyo rin kung ano yung position ng Philippines on certain topics and how they were presented by President Marcos during the summits here in ASEAN. So there's a web page for that. And after everything, we do actually expect another interview or press conference with President Marcos to wrap up this visit to Cambodia. I might see you again tomorrow for a recap naman talaga on the whole trip. And also, this won't be the last of my face and me yet, because on the 16th, President Marcos flies off to Bangkok naman to participate in the APEC summit, where we'll see world leaders participating in the summit. Iba naman yung format nun, so I'll walk you through that again when it's available. And that's it for now. I don't think there are a lot of questions. I was checking the comments earlier. Just people saying hi. But yeah, if you have any questions about what it's like covering President Marcos specifically, because he's the first president na talaga. I've been covering closely. Other presidents I have covered, but not as the reporter assigned to cover Malacanang or the palace or the administration. So if you have any questions, you can leave a comment here, or you can actually even tweet me. I don't know, uso pa ba yan ngayon? To tweet me at Beacopin on Twitter, kung may Twitter pa, joke lang. And that's it for now here in Phnom Penh. We will be airing live the closing ceremony of the ASEAN summits, and probably also yung Filipino community meeting here in Cambodia as his last public event before he flies back to Manila. And that's it for now. I'll see you in Manila. We'll see you in Manila, and then I'll see you in Bangkok in a few days again to cover the ASEAN summit. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, again, you can leave a comment here, or you can tweet Rappler or tweet me. We have a live, a running live updates page all about President Marcos here at ASEAN. But you can also check the page that I mentioned earlier for a summary of his interventions here at the ASEAN summit. So if you want to read about the positions that he's made, that's a wonderful resource. And that's it for me. I'm Beacopin from reporting live or speaking to you from Phnom Penh. Thank you for watching. Bye.